Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? We begin with the finding of a predator publisher. The OMICs group has been found guilty in a case against them by the Fair Trade Commission in America. They've been hit with a $50 million fine for what has been described as the scamming of thousands of scientists. The OMICs group is part of a larger problem with predator publishers and research. In general, at the minute, you could publish an article for anywhere between $200 and $300. In some cases as much as $500. The publisher will take your work, copy it, and paste it onto their webpage, in as little as 3 hours in some cases. The OMICs group is a little different. They won't charge you a few $100. They will charge you a few $1,000, which is on par with legitimate journals. Unlike a legitimate journal, what you will not get is any kind of peer review or editing. They will, much like an illegitimate or predator publisher, take your work and put it up on their webpage. This is a major factor in the decision to find the OMICs group guilty. Although the OMICs group owner, Gadala, is appealing, and it is unlikely the Fair Trade Commission will be able to collect its entire fine, it is a substantial impact on their annual revenue. Past work on predator publishers included work by Jeffrey Beal, who created something called Beal's List of Predatory Publishers, and he's described this as great news, as OMICs was one of those that he listed frequently and often contested his description of them. Unfortunately, they are but one factor in this large scheme of predator publishers. It is likely that there will be many more to take their place, and that this will not have a significant effect on their long-term operation. In slightly more interesting and relevant news, an ancestor of the whale has been found, a four-legged ancestor that dwelt on land. This has helped to bridge the gap between what we know to be a sea-based creature and its land-based ancestor. Ken Ham must be spitting about this after his claims for years that there was no way to prove that a cow could turn into a whale. Well, unfortunately it's not a cow, but a deer that has turned into a whale. We know what it was like when it was a land-based life form, and its transition to a semi-aquatic, a wading animal, and then eventually into a full seaborne creature. Whales are interesting in that respect because they carry many vestigial organs. This includes limbs that have not been used and have shrunk until they are no longer externally visible. That is why looking at a whale now, you would not have realized it came from the land. For example, whales have rear legs. They're simply not visible. This is not the flipper on their tail, but actual legs that are buried inside their body. Their front legs morphed into the flippers that we know now. Knowing that they had a common land-based four-legged ancestor explains why some of these structures exist. In a similar kind of weird discovery, researchers have found giant bacteria use a CRISPR-like function to both protect their host and to alter the host's DNA. Giant viruses are much larger than your regular virus, some of which can be as little as 2 genes big. This may be several thousand or several hundred nucleotides long. In contrast, the largest virus known to exist is 276,000 base pairs long. These new giant viruses use the bacteria's normal CRISPR DNA function, which we use to alter their own internal DNA or protect them from invading viruses, to instead attack their own DNA and defend the virus from other trespassers. This is beginning to blur the line between life and death as far as viruses are concerned, which historically have not been considered a living organism. Speaking of gene editing technology, scientists have used something like CRISPR to alter bacteria to make spider silk. Weight for weight, spider silk is much stronger than steel. The shortcoming is that farming spiders is very hard and surprisingly inefficient. Finding a way to produce this material has been something of a golden grail for some decades. And now that they've found a way to use bacteria, this might be like ethanol production or insulin production. The researchers used a gel-based pool of bacteria, and for each liter of this bacteria culture they made, they produced 2 grams of spider silk. This is a relatively small and unimpressive product, but the progress itself is very impressive. Hopefully in the future, through upscaling and technological improvement, they'll be able to both improve the yield and require less of it and less of this genetically modified bacteria to achieve the same result. In good news, if you're a fan of kittens or really don't like parasites, the US government has agreed to stop killing thousands of kittens each year in research for parasites. The US Department for Agriculture has said it will stop purposely infecting kittens to harvest parasite eggs. This process generally results in the death of the kitten. Each year, more than 3,000 are used by the Department of Agriculture's Research Service. They breed T. gondii in particular. This puts an end to more than 30 years of this practice. In not so upbeat news, scientists have implanted a transparent skull into mice. They think this will be able to help them to glean new insights into how the brain functions as a whole. Research into Alzheimer's and Parkinson's are particular favorites for this line of reasoning. This methodology allows them to look at brain activity at the smallest level, and even going so far as specific neurons, while getting a picture of the whole brain. So while one hand gives to the kittens, the other hand takes from the mice. A meta-review coming out recently has examined the effect of carbohydrates, particularly whether or not you get a sugar rush or a sugar crash, and how this would affect your mood. The short version of this is they found carbohydrates do not have any particularly beneficial effect on your mood. The carbohydrate consumption can lower alertness 60 minutes after consumption and increase fatigue within 30 minutes. This means that in the short term, carbohydrates do not appear to be of great benefit. However, they do not appear to have examined the long-term results. For example, more than 90 minutes once food enters the lower digestive tract. This meta-analysis used 31 studies with 1,259 participants. This appears to be a relatively thorough examination, but it had limited effect due to its small sample size and the limited number of people in the studies. This means the review may have incorporated studies with a poor design. Overall, the results are interesting, but they have yet to be further vindicated. In further novel and interesting news, a study of the phosphorylation of 2-thyroidine provides evidence of either nucleotides or DNA building blocks via photoreduction. This is more or less an extension of an earlier video describing how early life could have begun through activation of energy to create DNA or RNA. The simplified version of which is that the essential building blocks to life, nucleotides in the form of DNA or RNA, could be formed under primordial scenarios in which there was enough material and energy through either UV radiation or similar. This study provides plausible evidence of both its viability and its practical application. The key here is that their evidence shows not only DNA as being possible, but RNA occurring at the same time. RNA is currently only a product of DNA transcription. In this case, it's possible that RNA could have developed contemporaneously with DNA, and that it was simply overtaken over time and through evolutionary pressures. In other interesting news, a very simple math problem has been solved to a degree. The problem x cubed plus y cubed plus z cubed equals k seems simple enough on the surface. Take the cube of 3 values and they equal a third. For individual numbers, this is relatively easy, so long as you are working in single digits. Once you start getting into double or triple digits, it becomes much more difficult. In this case, it's taken roughly 50 years to get to the point where we've solved all but 3 of the numbers under 100. Most recently, the numbers 33 and 74 have been solved. This leaves k equals 42 as the only number under 100 to not be solved. The interesting thing here is not that they've been solved, but what drove the researchers to solve them. What sparked solutions to those 2 numbers is another YouTube channel called Numberphile. They produced videos on this particular problem, and after viewing it, the researchers decided to give it a crack themselves, and they've come back with their solutions. It is an example of science communication being both effective as a way of getting information out and to create more research. Next we have the CDC reporting on the 2019 measles cases. So far in this year, there have been 387 diagnoses. Last year in its entirety had 372, and the worst year before that had 667. We are less than 4 months into 2019, and already we are more than halfway to the highest year so far. That is an incredible jump, just based on year-to-year averages. This may well be a case of a perfect storm, in which you have low vaccination rates, the right people in the right places, and the right vulnerabilities. More likely, it's just the tip of an iceberg, and the problem is going to get worse over the coming years. The problem here is that measles are an entirely avoidable issue. Having adequate vaccination rates of roughly 95% ensures that even those who cannot receive the vaccine are protected. But in many cases, this is not the vaccination rate. Some areas are as low as 70%. Even third world and developing countries have better vaccination rates than these areas in America. Speaking of third world and developing countries, India has been launching anti-satellite missiles, and this has put the ISS at risk. India launched its own test missile on the 28th of March. This shot down one of their own satellites in orbit. It's seen as something of a major breakthrough, but for very different reasons by different people. The threat to the ISS in this case is not because of the missiles themselves, although that is another concern. Rather, the debris from the satellite that was destroyed has not entered the atmosphere and been burnt up, but has joined all the other space trash. In the past, this has damaged solar panels, communication arrays, and other things in space. India expects that any debris that has been made will fall back and burn up in the atmosphere within weeks. The problem is that is weeks in which it can pose a viable threat to the space station. At present, 60 pieces are being tracked, of which 24 pose a viable threat to the space station. In more upbeat and bizarre news, Garfield phones have been polluting France's coastline for decades, and they finally figured out why. Since 1978, Garfield-shaped paraphernalia in the form of a phone has been washing up on the coastlines of France. Garfield is a black and orange cat, well known for his love of lasagna and his hatred of the dog. The lovable but stupid dog's name was Odie. Garfield was looked after by his owner John, who put up with much of his nonsense. In the 80s, a large orange-coloured Garfield phone was produced, and this was used as a novelty piece, much like other toys made nowadays for movies. But around the same time, the same ferns started washing up on the beaches of the Royce Bay in Brittany. This issue made sense when they were for sale, as it could well have been that someone was simply dumping them as waste and now washing back onto the shore. However, once they stopped being sold, it made less sense, but they continued to wash up regardless. It would appear that for at least one person, it wasn't a mystery at all. They knew that in the 80s, during a large storm, a ship was grounded and at least one shipping container came off the boat. This became stuck in a cave, and it turns out that shipping container was full of Garfield ferns. Over time, through erosion and deterioration of the steel structure, the ferns have been escaping, and as they've been escaping, they've been washing up on the shore. While the French have been finding caves full of mystery Garfield ferns, and then not telling anyone, American adults are not having sex. And, much to everyone's surprise, this is at a record high. 23% of Americans report not having sex in the last year. Closer to 33% report not in the last month, and just under 50% report not in the last week. Interestingly, the breakdown here is about 18% amongst women and 28% amongst men. This appears to be the result of both cultural and social changes, with those under 30 tending to be single, or at least not living with their partner. This has made an arguable case as to why there is less sex going on. On the opposite end of the spectrum, those above 60 appear to be having more sex than expected. The final thing this week is that Washington State has decided to ban any book donations towards prisoners. Prisoners are already limited in what they have access to. Their ability to be educated is generally not that good, and assuming you're in there for a relatively minor crime, such as drug use, you may find that education is an important factor for when they leave, assuming you want rehabilitation and not just punishment. By banning book donations, prisoners will be unable to access what is already a very limited facility as far as reading material goes. While prison should not necessarily be a place of comfort, prisoners should, on the assumption that they are being rehabilitated, have access to some form of education to ensure that when they leave, they are able to re-enter society in a functional capacity. There is no point punishing a prisoner twice for the same thing, once behind bars, and second time once they are out of prison where they are unable to make any progress in life, due to a lack of education and information. Literature is one of the most important means of doing that, and denying them access to even used books from volunteer or non-profit vendors is simply silly. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it useful, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.